बातचीत को हम फंडामेंटल्स के नज़रिए पे आगे बढ़ाते हैं। हमारे साथ प्रमोद गुब्बी जुड़ रहे हैं, मार्सलस एसेट मैनेजमेंट के को फाउंडर, और प्रमोद हमारे रेगुलर कंट्रीब्यूटर हैं चैनल पे। प्रमोद, शुक्रिया हमसे बात करने के लिए। प्रमोद, मैं आपसे ये जो वल्लभ बंसाली जी की कमेंट्री आईटी सेक्टर पे आई है, उससे बातचीत को मैं आगे लेके चलना चाहूँगा। जी हाँ, ये एक्सपोर्ट ओरिएंटेड सेक्टर है और लोगों ने ऑलरेडी इसको काफ़ी डिरेट कर दिया अपना कोविड पीक से लेके। क्या ये वैल्यू जोन में आ गया है? इंडियन आईटी के जो दोनों पार्ट्स हैं, लार्ज कैप और मिड कैप आईटी, आप उस इन स्पेसेस में अपॉर्चुनिटीज़ कैसी दिखती हैं? मेरे हिसाब से आपके पास एक लार्ज कैप स्टॉक है अपने बड़े पोर्टफोलियो में, टीसीएस, तो ये सेक्टर तो आप जानते हैं बहुत अच्छी तरह।
Right. No, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So IT is obviously a global sector. ज़्यादातर export orientedness है. Given the interest rate hikes that we've seen and the pressure put on global economy, particularly in Indian IT service industries core customer base, वहाँ पे recessionary trends आ रहे हैं. Naturally, as a result of that, थोड़ा IT spends will also be cut over the short term. But I would tend to agree with Mr. Bansali from a longer term perspective, given the way the world is digitizing every aspect of our lives. IT cannot go away. If at all, it will only become a larger part of our lives. To that extent, the long-term growth opportunity for Indian IT services is fairly intact. Our valuation be abhi thoda I wouldn't say value zone, but at least it's become more sensible, at least for from long-term investors' perspective. This would be as good a time to buy. Our preference is in companies where you have very strong supply side strengths. When I say supply side, ultimately IT services people's business hota hai. So you have to hire people to deliver those projects. And as you saw in the last 2 years, particularly during COVID, when there was a tech boom, there was shortage of employees. As a result of that, companies had to pay significant hikes in wages, which had impact on the margins of these IT services companies. So that is going to be a longer term constraint. And therefore, if you can focus on companies which have the ability to train and retrain tens of thousands of engineers every year, you should be in a better place from a long-term margin perspective, long-term return perspective. उस हिसाब से हमारे choices रहे हैं TCS और Infosys, दोनों ने पिछले 30-40 साल से काफी investments किया है training infrastructure में. They have one of the best training facilities. They have the capabilities in terms of knowledge systems in-house. And as a result, that supply side strength becomes a comparative advantage in the Indian IT service industry. Demand side is intact. I agree with Mr. Bansali, but the choice of stocks has to be based on supply side strengths.
राइट प्रमोद, गुड मॉर्निंग। साथ ही हम आपसे ये भी जानना चाहेंगे कि 2023 के लिए बैंक्स एंड फाइनेंशियल्स, क्योंकि 2022 में बैंक्स एंड फाइनेंशियल्स ने जिस तरह की आउट परफॉर्मेंस दिखाई है, बी इट द क्रेडिट ग्रोथ सिनेरियो, नेट इंटरेस्ट इनकम और साथ ही लगातार एनपीएस का घटना, क्या आपको लगता है यही रफ्तार 2023 की शुरुआत से लेकर भी बैंक्स फाइनेंशियल्स में जारी रहेगी? और अगर हाँ, तो पीएसयू बैंक और प्राइवेट बैंक में कौन से थीम्स आपको पसंद आते हैं?
You're right. I think financials have had a great run in the last 18 months or so. I don't think the same level of sort of appreciation you can expect. In any case, एक साल का view तो बहुत ही मुश्किल होता है लेने में. But I would think, given we are in a good position from an economic cycle perspective, which is India is recovering, at least you can take a 3-year view that we will be able to grow pretty strongly over the next 3 years. There is no economic cycle recovery without the banking system recovery. So therefore, the banks have to participate in this recovery through credit growth. We are already seeing banking system credit growth at 15, 16, 17%. This is the best that we've seen in more than a decade. That is likely to continue. Having said that, I think the stock price rallies that you saw also had an element of re-rating, particularly in the PSU bank space. That is unlikely to continue. In my view, currently the PSU banks are more or less fairly priced. You don't see that valuation opportunity anymore. From here on, I think investors need to be more selective. Focus on banks which have very strong deposit franchise, because abhi aapka credit to deposit ratio has gone up, right? Because loan demand is very strong, but deposit growth cannot come by very quickly. So therefore, banks are having to pay more for deposits, and that will put a pressure on margins. If you don't have a strong CASA franchise, if you don't have a strong deposit franchise, आपको margin pressure और ज़्यादा होगा. So there, as a result, you don't expect the entire banking system to do well like it did over the last 18 months. I think this year and perhaps the next 2 years, you'll have to be selective. Just like in IT, I suggested focus on the supply side here as well. I would think you'd be better off focusing on the supply side, where banks with very strong deposit franchise will be able to deliver the growth that the economy is offering, but at the same time keep their margins intact because they don't have to pay higher cost on their deposits. So our preference has been on strong deposit franchise banks like HDFC Bank and Kotak Bank. Between PSU banks and private sector banks, we've always preferred private sector banks. In our financials fund, we also own the other two private sector banks, ICICI and Axis. The top 4 private sector banks have invested in technology, have invested in a very strong CASA franchise, and we reckon that would be our preference to play the banking sector over the next 2-3 years.
मिस्टर गुब्बी, एक और चीज समझना चाहेंगे आपसे, एफएमसीजी स्पेस में आप किस तरह की डिस्ट्रप्शन देखते हैं? अगर रिलायंस भी, हालांकि बहुत बड़ा ये मार्केट शेयर अभी फिलहाल नहीं होगा, लेकिन किस तरह की डिस्ट्रप्शन हो सकती है कि रिलायंस बिगर लेवल पर एफएमसीजी प्लेयर को अपने एक्सपैंड कर देता ओवर द इयर्स? अभी तो सिर्फ एंट्री पॉइंट की बात हो रही है, हालांकि बहुत हद तक वो प्राइवेट लेबल्स अपने करते हैं. कैसी डिस्ट्रप्शन हो सकती है एफएमसीजी स्पेस में?
Well, FMCG is the bread and butter of the Indian domestic consumption story, right? क्योंकि हम अभी भी थर्ड वर्ल्ड कंट्री है, 140 करोड़ लोग हैं, जिसमें से ज़्यादातर रोटी कपड़ा मकान के लिए they are literally striving. To that extent, staples has a very, very long growth runway in this country. I would think multiple decades of fairly reasonable growth. To that extent, the opportunity is there for new entrants to come in. Having said that, it's not that easy because this is a vast country. This requires significant strengths in distribution and supply chain. At the same time, requires significant strengths in branding in terms of being able to pull in consumers. However, given the advent of digital marketing, digital media, it has become that much more to build, that much easier rather to build brands very quickly. And for somebody like Reliance, I'm sure they have been at the cutting edge of digital through the telecom and media and retail initiatives. Building a brand shouldn't be a problem, but building the logistics and the backbone takes some time. Having said that, I wouldn't say it is not possible or it is impossible. But some of the incumbents will have entrenched strengths in these spaces around brand and distribution. It should be able to defend themselves. But the long-term story being intact, I think there is scope for other players to come in as well, which is why you're seeing this new entry.
इस सवाल आप केमिकल मैन्युफैक्चरिंग के फील्ड में जो कैपिटल गुड्स बनाती हैं, ऐसी कंपनीज पर भी बहुत पुराने टाइम से बुलिश रहे हैं. जीएमएम फॉडलर जैसी कंपनीज अपने आप में बहुत यूनिक है, क्योंकि केमिकल इंडस्ट्री में ब्रॉयलर्स या तो जर्मन कंपनीज बना रही हैं या जीएमएम फॉडलर, सो एक बड़ा शेयर है उनका. वहाँ पे आज एक बड़ा ब्लॉक डील भी हुआ. लेकिन आप फंडामेंटल्स कैसे देखते हैं? क्योंकि जीएमएम फॉडलर की कमेंट्री और यहाँ से रोड मैप पूरे इंडियन केमिकल के बारे में भी बहुत बड़ा रिफ्लेक्शन है. आपने तो स्टडी किया है वो बिजनेस मॉडल जीएमएम का.
Correct. Yes, we have been shareholders of GMM Fodler for a long time. We own it in our personal portfolios as well as in our clients' portfolios for a long time now. And we have been beneficiaries of that growth. You're absolutely right. It's a play on the Indian chemical manufacturing and pharmaceutical sectors, because GMM's products, which is basically the glass-lined reactors, go into chemical manufacturing. And as we have seen in the recent past, the global resourcing, which is the China Plus One strategy, has meant that a lot of the areas, particularly in areas like APIs and specialty chemicals in general, there is shift in sourcing happening from China to India. As a result, there is plenty of capex activity happening within the chemicals and pharmaceutical sectors in India. given GMM Pfaudler operates in by and large a duopoly along with HLE Glass Coat. Much of that capex activity is flowing to these two companies, and GMM is a beneficiary as well. Their order books are running fairly full with pretty long waiting periods. To that extent, I think additional capacity expansion plans for GMM is called for. Given both the long-term growth opportunity as well as the industry structure where competitive intensity is just between two players, it becomes an ideal industry for us to participate in. And we continue to be quite positive on the prospects of this sector.
प्रमोद, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आज हमसे बात करने के लिए। लेकिन आगे बढ़ते हैं, एक और